The federal building on Harbor Drive looked smaller than it had the first time. Riley Holt sat in the parking lot with the engine off, watching the lights on the third floor, the way you watch something you have already decided to walk toward. Rain came down in thin lines, not hard enough to matter, just enough to blur the edges of everything. On the passenger seat beside her was a manila envelope, already open, already read. She did not look at it again. She had read it enough times that the words had stopped being words and become something else. The shape of a decision she had made before she understood she was making it. 13 years ago, a helicopter fell out of the sky over Kunar Province, Afghanistan. The official report said mechanical failure. 37 words. Riley Holt had read those 37 words so many times over so many years that she could recite them the way other people recite prayers, automatically without thinking, in the back of her mind at 3 in the morning when sleep refused to come. Tonight, she was going to make someone recite them to her face and explain every single lie buried inside them. She picked up the envelope, set it back down, looked at the third floor lights one more time. Then she drove away. Because tonight was not that night. Tonight was still the beginning, and beginnings had their own requirements. And the first requirement was Coronado. Naval Amphibious Base Coronado, 5 in the morning, September 2024. The California fog sat low over the beach, thick and salt white, the kind that does not burn off until mid-morning and makes the world feel like it ends 50 feet in every direction. Riley Holt stood in a line of 47 men who did not want her there. She was 5'4", 123 pounds. In a formation that collectively weighed close to 10,000 pounds and averaged 6'1", she was the smallest person on the grinder by a significant margin. She was also the only woman in basic underwater demolition and SEAL training class 412, the first integrated class in the history of naval special warfare, a fact that the Navy's Public Affairs Office had handled with considerable care, and that the 47 men standing around her had been equally careful not to discuss out loud. She had not come here to be a first. She had come because her father had stood in this exact spot, and the men who killed him were still wearing the uniform. Senior Chief Owen Briggs walked the line with the unhurried authority of a man who had made careers and ended them in this same half-mile stretch of sand and concrete. He was 43 years old, built like someone had assembled him from parts that were each individually too large, with a face that had absorbed 20 years of sun and salt water and expressed nothing it did not choose to express. His voice, when he spoke, carried the flat precision that bypassed the ear and landed somewhere behind the sternum. He did not say anything about Riley's presence. He did not pause in front of her. He walked the entire line, turned at the end, and addressed Class 412 as a unit. What he said was standard. Welcome to BUD/S. This will be the hardest thing you ever do. Most of you will not finish. The ones who do will understand why after the fact, but not before. The training exists not to punish you, but to locate the specific quality that cannot be installed through effort or desire. The quality that is either there or is not, and that only the training can find. What Riley noticed was not his words, it was his eyes. He had passed her twice during the walk. The second time, for exactly 3 seconds, his gaze moved to the phone in his breast pocket and then back to her face. It was subtle, the kind of thing you only caught if you were already watching for it. Riley was watching for everything. Her grandfather had spent 31 years in uniform, teaching her that the most important information in any room was usually not being spoken aloud, that it lived in the pauses, the glances, the small adjustments that people made when they thought no one was cataloging them. She filed it, kept her face still, kept her breathing even. The California sun would not clear the fog for another 2 hours. Class 412 went to work. The photograph had been with her since she was 16 years old. It lived in the left breast pocket of whatever she was wearing. A habit so ingrained she no longer thought about it consciously. The way you stop thinking about a ring you have worn for years. 4 inches by 3, slightly creased along one edge from the time she had fallen asleep holding it during the long drive home from her father's memorial. Daniel Holt stood in the center, laughing at something outside the frame, wearing a training shirt with the sleeves cut off. He had his hand on the shoulder of the man beside him, easy and familiar, the way men stand next to people they would carry out of hell without being asked. That man had been cut out of the photograph. You could still see part of a shoulder, part of an arm, a sliver of a face that told you nothing. Riley had cut him out herself at age 19, when she had first begun to understand that not every man who had stood beside her father had deserved to be there. Master Chief Daniel Holt, SEAL Team 6, 19 years of service. Silver Star, Bronze Star with Valor, twice. Killed in action, March 22nd, 2011, Kunar Province, Afghanistan. Official cause of death, Helicopter mechanical failure during combat insertion. Riley had been 13 years old enough to understand what the folded flag meant, old enough to stand straight backed at the funeral while men she had never met told her what a hero her father was. Old enough to know, somewhere underneath the grief, that something about those 37 words did not fit the shape of the man she had known. The man who checked every piece of equipment twice, who never flew anything he had not personally inspected, who had taught her by the time she was 10 years old that mechanical failures in the field were almost never mechanical and almost always human. Her grandfather, Colonel Frank Holt, retired Army Ranger, had put language to that feeling 2 years after the fact. He had been sitting at the kitchen table in Roanoke, Virginia, coffee going cold beside his elbow, a legal pad covered in his small, precise handwriting in front of him. He looked up at Riley, who was 15 and doing homework at the same table, and said quietly, "The maintenance records for that helicopter. Someone signed off on equipment that should have been grounded. And when I asked to see the full documentation, I was told the records had been archived. All of them, simultaneously." She had looked up from her homework. "That does not happen," Frank said. "Not like that, not all at once." She had gone back to her work. She had not forgotten. Frank spent 13 years knocking on doors that stayed closed. Every investigation request was denied. Every inquiry to the chain of command produced the same result: archived, resolved, closed. And every time a door closed, the same shadow appeared somewhere near the hinge, not prominently, not in writing, but present the way a person's shadow is present even when they have stepped out of the room. The same institutional weight, quietly applied, that turned inquiries into dead ends. He had followed money through contractor networks and shell companies to the edge of something large and institutional, something with roots deep enough that nothing above it could be shaken loose. He had done this carefully, methodically, in the manner of an Army Ranger who understood that patience and precision were more reliable than speed. And every time he got close enough to see the shape of the thing, a door closed, and he started again from a different angle. 2 months ago, a Defense Intelligence Agency analyst named Carol Reese had found the same shape from a different direction. She had called Frank. She said she had the financial records, the communication patterns, the documented proof of an intelligence network that had been selling classified SEAL operational data to foreign buyers since 2004. She said she had the names. She said she was ready to move. Carol Reese had died 4 days ago. The Potomac River. Official cause: suicide by drowning. Carol Reese had been a competitive swimmer since she was 16 years old. She held her swim club's freestyle record for 15 consecutive years. The last time Riley had spoken to her father was a phone call 3 days before the flight. She had been 13, and it had been late, past 10, which her mother would not have allowed if she had known, but Andrea Holt was at the hospital, and Daniel was calling from 7 time zones away, and the rules that existed when things were normal did not fully apply to either of them in those circumstances. He asked her about school, about track, about the book she was reading. She had been reading a biography of a Navy admiral, which he found funny and also did not find surprising in the way that things about Riley did not surprise him. He asked her if she was keeping up with her swimming. She said she had beaten her personal record in the butterfly by 4 seconds. He was quiet for a moment, then, 4 seconds is not a small thing. That is the kind of improvement that comes from understanding something you did not understand before, not just from working harder. What did you figure out? She had thought about it. "I stopped fighting the water," she said. "I stopped trying to push it out of the way. I just moved through it." Another pause, the kind of pause her father made when something struck him as worth sitting with. "Write that down somewhere," he said. "That is a lesson that is going to apply to things besides swimming." It was the last thing he ever taught her. She had written it down, in the margin of the biography she was reading, in the handwriting of a 13-year-old who did not yet understand that she was writing down the last thing. She still had the book. It was on a shelf in the apartment in Roanoke where she had stayed between deployments, between phases of her life, between the different versions of herself that each new chapter had required. She had never been able to give the book away. She had been living in versions of that phone call for 13 years, stopping fighting the water, moving through it instead of against it. She had not always been good at the lesson. There had been years, particularly the 2 years after her mother died, when she had been 23 years old and fully alone in a way she had not been prepared for, when fighting seemed more honest than moving. When the grief was so ambient and complete that choosing to move through it felt like a betrayal of its weight. But the lesson came back. The way things that are true come back, regardless of how long you spend arguing with them. Riley had looked at the photograph for a long time the night Frank told her about Carol Reese. Then she had put it back in her breast pocket and started packing for Coronado. The morning of day 3, Riley ran 4 miles on the beach in soft sand with a 40-pound pack in 41 minutes and 17 seconds, which placed her second in Class 412 and ahead of men who had been training for this their entire adult lives. She was aware of Lieutenant Travis Mercer watching from the edge of the course. He was 29 years old, 6 feet 2, 215 pounds, of the kind of confidence that comes not from achievement, but from the belief that achievement is your birthright. He had 4 years with SEAL Team 7, a father whose rank had opened every door he had ever needed opened, and the particular ease of a man who had never been in a room where the rules did not bend slightly in his favor. His file, which Riley had reviewed through a JAG contact before shipping out, noted commendations for marksmanship and small unit tactics and 2 separate complaints from junior enlisted personnel regarding conduct during training, both resolved administratively, meaning closed without consequence, within 30 days of filing. The pattern was clear if you knew how to read it. He was not an assigned instructor for Class 412. He had volunteered as support staff, which gave him legal standing to be present on the beach, in the kill house, at the obstacle course, anywhere the class operated. He had arrived at Coronado the same week Riley did, which she noted and filed alongside the look Briggs had given her on day 1. When Riley crossed the finish line, Mercer was standing 12 feet away with his arms crossed and his eyes on her timesheet. He did not say anything. He made a small, precise note on the clipboard he was carrying, the kind of note a person makes when they are tracking something specific toward a specific purpose. She kept her face neutral, kept walking. That evening, she opened her father's photograph one more time, looked at the cut edge where the second man used to be, put it away. On the morning of day 5, Senior Chief Briggs announced close quarters battle familiarization in the kill house. He called for 2 volunteers to demonstrate basic disarm technique for the class. Mercer's hand was up before Briggs finished the sentence. Briggs let the silence sit for exactly 4 seconds before his eyes moved down the line to Riley. "Holt, you're his partner." She stepped forward. Her heart rate did not change. Her grandfather had drilled that into her over 2 decades of training in his barn in Roanoke. Control your breathing, control your pulse, control the frame of the situation before the situation has the chance to frame you. The kill house smelled like rubber mats and gun oil and the faint metallic undertone that came from years of spent brass in an enclosed space. The class gathered around the perimeter. Briggs explained the technique: redirect the weapon arm, control at the elbow, take the partner down. Standard instruction. The kind of thing you learned in week 1 and spent years refining into something that worked under real conditions. Mercer pulled the rubber training knife from his belt. He moved into position. Their eyes met. Riley saw it in the half second before it happened. Not the knife, his weight shift, the rotation of his hips, the loading of his right leg that had nothing to do with a controlled demonstration at training speed. She got her hands up. She was fast, genuinely fast, faster than people expected from her frame. But she had been positioned for a demonstration, not for a full-speed combat strike from a man who outweighed her by 90 pounds. The spinning heel kick connected with the left side of her face with the force of something that could not be called anything other than intentional. The impact traveled through bone and cartilage. The room inverted. The padded floor came up. She tasted copper, felt warmth spreading from her nose across her cheek. The ringing in her ears had the specific pitch of something structural that had changed. Through the ringing, she heard Mercer's voice. Easy, unhurried. The tone of a man who had scored a point in a game only he knew was being played. "Wrong career, sweetheart. Try the galley." 47 men stood very still. Some looked at the floor. A few looked at Mercer. Nobody looked at Briggs. Riley looked at Briggs. He was standing at the back of the room with his arms at his sides and his face arranged in the expression of a man watching an expected outcome arrive on schedule. Not surprise, not anger. Something closer to patience. The patience of a man who had arranged for something to happen and was now confirming that it had happened as arranged. She filed that away with everything else. Riley pushed herself to her hands and knees. Blood from her face fell onto the gray mat, bright red against flat nothing. Her cheekbone felt wrong in the specific way that things feel wrong when something structural has changed permanently. The room swayed once and steadied. She stood up, wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. She looked at Mercer. 2 words, flat and final. "My turn." What happened in the next 4 seconds had not been in Briggs's demonstration plan. Riley had not trained in Navy CQB doctrine. She had trained in her grandfather's barn for 12 years, starting at age 14, after Frank decided that the world her father had not come home from required her to understand how it functioned from the ground level upward. Army combatives, judo. The particular economy of motion that comes from someone who has been hit enough times to understand that efficiency and timing matter far more than size, and that a slight woman who was patient was more dangerous than a large man who acted on instinct. She faked high. Her hands came up as if targeting his knife arm. His weight shifted to cover. Then her left foot swept his lead leg, hard, low, timed to the precise moment his weight had fully committed to the direction she had shown him. His balance broke. His arms went wide. She pivoted, caught his extended arm, used his own momentum the way a river uses a stone, not to stop it, but to redirect it entirely. 4 seconds. Mercer's face met the mat. She maintained the arm bar. Pressure on the elbow, the shoulder, everything his father's rank could not protect right now. She leaned close enough that only he could hear. That's one. She released him, stepped back. The room did not cheer. These were not people who cheered in moments like this. But the silence changed texture, from the silence of shock to the silence of 47 men recalibrating something fundamental about what they had witnessed and about what they intended to do with that information going forward. Briggs said, "Holt, medical, now." She walked out under her own power. The corpsman at the medical tent diagnosed her in the time it took to put on gloves. Zygomatic arch, possible orbital involvement, definite concussion, 6 weeks minimum, possibly 8. This was a medical drop. She said, "Tape it." He said, "That is not how bones work." She said, "I know how bones work. Tape it anyway." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the photograph that had fallen from her pocket when she sat down on the cot. Daniel Holt in his training shirt, laughing, the cut edge where someone used to be. He did not ask about it. He reached for the tape. 48 hours, he said, then you come back. If you lose vision, if the headache changes character, if anything feels different than it does right now, you come back immediately. Agreed? She agreed. He taped her face with the careful precision of someone who had done this before and did not approve of doing it again. He gave her ibuprofen and instructions she would follow selectively. She walked back to the barracks in the afternoon sun with her left eye swelling toward closed and her cheekbone making its objections known with every step. She had work to do. That night, alone in her rack with the barracks dark around her, Riley photographed her face from 6 angles using her phone propped against her canteen. Clinical documentation. Then she typed a formal statement. Exact sequence, exact positions, exact words spoken, exact timestamps, while the memory was still unprocessed. She saved it to her phone, her personal laptop, and an encrypted cloud account she had established before shipping out. Her mother, Dr. Andrea Holt, had been a trauma surgeon at Inova Fairfax before the car accident that took her 3 years ago. She had raised Riley to understand that the difference between an incident and a record was documentation. That without a record, events became contested, and contested events tended to resolve in favor of whoever held the institutional weight. Her father had taught her that SEALs backed everything up and left nothing to chance. Her grandfather had taught her that the difference between a complaint and a case was evidence, and that evidence had to be built before it was needed, not after. She had 47 potential witnesses. She needed 3 who would go on record. Over the next 2 days, while her face turned colors that had no official names and her cheekbone made its position known every time she chewed or spoke, Riley learned which men in Class 412 had genuine honor and which ones simply wore the uniform because the pay was acceptable. PO2. Tyler Marsh found her at the waterline before dawn on the second morning. He was 25 years old, Navy corpsman from South Boston, with the kind of face that looked young until you got to his eyes, which had seen enough in 4 years of service to finish whatever youth had been left in them. He sat down in the sand beside her without being invited, which told her immediately that he had something to say and had decided to say it. "What Mercer did," he began. He stopped, started again. "My grandfather was at Chosin Reservoir, Marine Corps. He used to say the thing that stayed with him wasn't the cold or the enemy divisions. It was the 2 officers who cut and ran and left their men behind." He looked at the water. He said there are men who wear the uniform and men who earn it. You can always tell the difference if you're paying attention. Riley waited. "I'll testify," Marsh said. "Whatever you need, whenever you file. I was 6 feet away. I saw everything, start to finish." Why? Because what happened in that kill house was deliberate, and everyone in the room knew it. And someone needs to say so out loud where it cannot be taken back. He stood, brushed sand from his trousers. "Also because my grandfather never missed a chance to remind me that silence in the face of wrong was its own kind of wrong. He would not let me hear the end of it." 1. P.O. One Andre Cole came to her during a water break on day 7, 28 years old. Weapons specialist from Savannah, Georgia. Built low to the ground and very quiet in the way that quiet men are when they have already decided something and are not looking for permission. He had a daughter. He mentioned her in the second sentence, which told Riley everything she needed to understand about why he was standing in front of her. "I've got a daughter," he said. "She's 4. Her name is Simone." He looked at his hands for a moment. "Mercer has done this before. I know 2 men who washed out of previous classes after incidents that were classified as training injuries. One blew out his knee during a grappling evolution. The other aspirated water during a night swim and developed pneumonia from it." Cole's jaw tightened. Nobody filed anything. Both were told they could reclass and try again next year. Both went home and didn't come back. "You'll testify?" "Yes, and when Simone is old enough to understand what I do and why I do it, I want her to know that when something like this happened in front of me, I didn't look at the floor." He met Riley's eyes steadily. "That matters more to me than whatever the politics cost." 2. CWO Raymond Stokes found her on the beach that same evening, just as the light was going. He was 46 years old, weathered in the particular way of men who have spent more of their lives outdoors than in, with eyes that carried the specific weight of someone who has been holding something for a long time and has finally decided that holding it is no longer something he can afford. He worked logistics support for BUD/S, the kind of role that made you part of the machinery without making you part of the story, present for everything, credited in nothing. He had been in this position for 7 years, which meant he had watched Class 411 and Class 410 and every class before them come through the same beach. And he had been watching Class 412 since day one with the specific attention of a man who had been waiting for a particular name to appear on a roster. He sat down a few feet from her, did not look at her directly. "Your father called me the night before the flight," he said. Riley became very still. "We went through BUD/S together. Class 198. He made it through and I washed out on Hell Week with a stress fracture in my left tibia. Came back the following year, made it. By then he was already a year ahead of me, and the gap between us only grew in the right direction after that." Stokes watched the water move. "He called me around midnight, said he had found discrepancies in the equipment inspection records, maintenance documentation that did not match the actual work orders on file. He told me he had figured out who was responsible and that he was going to report it up the chain the next morning. He asked me to cover for him if he needed to slip the post-mission debrief." "What did you tell him?" "I said yes." A pause that held 13 years compressed inside 2 seconds. "I went to sleep. He did not come back." The Pacific moved in and out the way it always did. "I have been here 23 years, Stokes had said. "Every class that comes through this beach, I think about him. I think about that phone call. I think about what might have been different if I had asked him what he found, if I had told him to wait, if I had told someone else, if I had done anything other than say yes and go to sleep." He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a small black thumb drive. He held it out without looking at her. "I have been collecting this for 7 years. Incident reports, personnel transfer records, equipment inspection logs going back further than that, kill house camera footage from 2017 forward. Mercer's name appears in 4 separate training injury incidents across 3 BUD/S classes. 3 of those incidents resulted in candidates leaving the program within 2 weeks. And there is 1 name in the inspection documentation for the helicopter your father flew on March 22nd, 2011. The individual who countersigned the final maintenance inspection report 2 days before that flight, authorizing it for combat operations." Riley took the drive, light in her palm. The weight of everything was inside it. "Who signed it?" Stokes stood, brushed sand from his hands. He looked at her directly for the first time since he had sat down, and what she saw in his face was not guilt exactly. It was the older and harder thing that comes after guilt has proven insufficient to undo what happened. The thing that lives beyond guilt when guilt runs out. "I'm sorry I waited this long," he said. He walked back toward the base without turning around. Riley sat with the drive in her palm and listened to the ocean. The same ocean her father had listened to from this beach, in this fog, at this hour, more than 2 decades before she was born. She thought about 37 words and everything they had been designed to prevent her from knowing. She thought about the federal building on Harbor Drive and the manila envelope on the passenger seat and the lights on the 3rd floor. She thought about the night she had sat in that parking lot and driven away because it was not time yet. She was beginning to understand when it would be time. Frank called that night at 2200. His voice was the voice of a man who had learned over decades how to carry serious information across long distances without letting it fracture in transit. Controlled, precise, with something underneath it that was neither of those things. Something that had been held under pressure for 13 years and was now very close to the surface. "Carol Reese is dead," he said. 4 days ago, Potomac River. They are calling it a suicide." Riley said nothing. "Before she died, she encrypted a data package and transmitted it to me. I have been working on the decryption for 3 days. A pause. I finished it this afternoon. What did she find? Everything. Frank's voice went quieter, not with uncertainty, but with the precision of a man who understood that what he was about to say needed to be said very carefully. The name in your father's inspection records, the man who countersigned that maintenance documentation 2 days before the flight, who put that helicopter into the air knowing what had been done to it. He is not retired. He is not under investigation. He is currently serving in a position of direct oversight over naval special warfare training standards here at Coronado. Who is he? Frank said the name, clearly, without any hesitation, because the time for hesitation had passed 13 years ago on a helicopter over a valley in Kunar province. Riley looked out the barracks window. The base at night, quiet and still, the kind of quiet that is never actually quiet when you understand what is moving underneath it. 50 feet away, Senior Chief Owen Briggs was walking the perimeter path with his hands clasped behind his back, methodical and unhurried, the way he walked it every single evening. She watched him take 4 steps, 5, 6. Grandpa, her voice was very flat and very level. He is 50 feet away from me right now. The silence on the line lasted 3 seconds exactly. Riley, I know, she said. Listen to me carefully. I know. She watched Briggs disappear around the corner of the building. She had timed his perimeter route twice without consciously intending to. Her training had simply done it in the background, measuring intervals, calculating durations, the way it did everything. 4 minutes and 30 seconds to complete the circuit. I am not going to do anything tonight. Good, but he has been here every day since I arrived. I know. He watched Mercer kick me in the face and he did not look surprised. Frank was silent for a moment. Then, your father said the same thing the night before the flight. He said, I know who it is, I know what they did, and I am going to report it up the chain first thing tomorrow morning. A pause that carried the weight of everything that came after that sentence. He trusted the chain of command. Riley looked at the window, at the corner where Briggs had disappeared, at the empty path where he would reappear in less than 4 minutes. I am not going to the chain, she said. I know, Frank said. That is precisely why I'm telling you. She ended the call, sat in the dark with the phone in her hand and the thumb drive on the mattress beside her and the photograph in her breast pocket pressing against her ribs the way it always had. The familiar specific weight of a dead man's face and a cut edge where someone used to stand. She put the phone down, picked up the drive, opened her laptop. The inspection records were there exactly where Stokes's documentation said they would be. One entry, March 20th, 2011, 2 days before the flight. A maintenance inspection, counter-signature, authorizing Daniel Holt's helicopter for combat insertion operations, the kind of final sign-off that a senior NCO with equipment oversight duties could legitimately be asked to provide, and that would have appeared entirely routine to anyone not looking for what it meant. The name on the signature line was Owen Briggs. Senior Chief Owen Briggs, who was currently walking a perimeter path 50 feet away from where she sat, who had looked at her on day one with something she now understood not as calculation, but as recognition. The recognition of a man who had known exactly who she was from the moment her name appeared on the Class 412 roster, and who had been watching her with the specific attention of someone for whom her presence represented a problem that needed managing. Riley closed the laptop, sat in the dark barracks room, let the information settle through her the way cold water settles, all at once, completely, reaching every part of her simultaneously. She thought about her father at 0541 in the morning, over a valley in Kunar province, on a helicopter that someone had cleared for flight 2 days earlier. She thought about 37 words. She thought about the federal building on Harbor Drive, and the manila envelope, and the lights on the 3rd floor, and the night she was going to walk through that door with everything she needed to make those 37 words finally tell the truth. Not yet. But the distance between not yet and soon had narrowed to something she could measure. She lay back on the rack and stared at the ceiling and did not sleep for a long time. When she finally did, it was the controlled and deliberate sleep of someone conserving energy for what was coming. The sleep her father had taught her when she was 12 years old and had asked him how he managed to fall asleep anywhere, in any conditions, under any kind of pressure. Because the mission does not care how you feel, Daniel Holt had told his daughter. The mission keeps going. So you rest when you can, and you move when you must, and you do not spend the energy you have on things that are not the mission. She had asked him what the mission was. He had thought about it for a genuine moment, the way he thought about things he took seriously, carefully, and without performance. Depends on the day, he said, but underneath all of it, if you are doing it right, it is always the same thing. You are protecting someone who cannot protect themselves. Everything else is the details of how. Riley Holt closed her eyes in the dark barracks at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado, 50 feet from the man who had signed the document that put her father in the sky on March 22nd, 2011, 3 weeks from the end of the hardest training the United States military had ever designed. And the mission was the clearest it had ever been. She thought about the federal building on Harbor Drive, and the parking lot, and the lights on the third floor that she had watched and then driven away from. She thought about what it would feel like to walk through that door with the envelope in her hand and the badge on her chest and the full weight of a completed case behind her. She thought about it in the way her father had taught her to think about objectives. Clearly, specifically, without embellishment, holding the image steady until it was more real than the darkness surrounding it. The image held. She rested. Tomorrow she would move. Hell Week began on a Sunday night at 2300 hours with instructors hitting the barracks doors like a home invasion. Blank rounds, flashbangs, the kind of controlled violence designed not to hurt you, but to reach inside your chest and rearrange whatever certainty had been left there. Riley was already sitting on her rack in the dark when it started, had been sitting there for 40 minutes. She heard the first door go down at the far end of the building, and she stood up, put her boots on, and walked into the chaos with her heart rate at 62 beats per minute, lower than it had been during the morning run 3 days before. She had learned to do that in her grandfather's barn in Roanoke, learned it the way Frank Holt taught everything, without naming the lesson, through repetition over years, until it became the body's default rather than the mind's instruction. The technique was not about feeling less. It was about letting fear run underneath the action without interrupting the action, the way deep current runs beneath the surface of a river and powers it without determining where it goes. Fear as fuel, not as brake. The first 6 hours of Hell Week were noise and cold water and sand in every seam of the human body, and instructors who had refined the precise application of discomfort over careers measured in decades. Riley moved through it the way she had moved through everything since she arrived at Coronado, methodically, without waste, with the economy of motion that came from someone who understood that the next hour was the only one that mattered. Hour 31, surf torture. The Pacific in late September sat at 64 degrees, which was the kind of cold that began as sensation and became geography. A country you entered and that entered you simultaneously, that rewrote the operating parameters of every muscle below the neck and did it with the patience of something that had been doing this to people for a very long time and was in no hurry. The class lay in the surf line. Waves moved over them in sets. The cold worked inward from the extremities toward the core with methodical precision. Tyler Marsh was on Riley's left. She could feel him shaking through the wet sand. It was not weakness. Every person in the line was shaking. But his shake had a quality beneath the cold that was about something more than temperature. She had watched enough men approach the decision to ring the bell in the past 30 hours to recognize the texture of it. She pressed the back of her left hand against his wrist. Not a grip, just contact. Then she tapped with one finger. Slow and steady, the rhythm her grandfather had taught her for keeping time without a watch. A counting pattern simple enough that the mind could hold on to it when nothing more complex was available. 1, 2, 3, 4. Stay here. Stay in this second. The next one will come on its own. Marsh felt it. His shaking changed rhythm, became something more controlled. He found the count, held onto it. She tapped for 22 minutes until the next evolution was called. They ran them up the beach and back and into the water and back and then onto the logs. A telephone pole of waterlogged timber per boat crew, around 200 pounds, distributed unevenly across 7 people, no matter how carefully you positioned yourself. Riley was on the left end. The man on her right was 6'3" and 230 pounds. The physics were unkind and entirely indifferent to her opinion of them. She did not think about the physics. She lifted and she moved and she counted steps the way she had been counting through the surf. In the gap between evolutions, standing in wet sand with her arms at her sides and the fog sitting on the water like it owned the place, she looked up at the berm above the beach and saw Mercer watching from above, arms crossed, clipboard under his arm. From this distance, expression unreadable. But he was not watching the class. He was watching her. She looked back at him for exactly 2 seconds, long enough to be deliberate. Then she looked away, back to the water, back to the next evolution, back to the mission. She was aware, without looking, that Mercer had taken out his phone. Hour 44. 23 men had rung the bell, the brass bell at the edge of the grinder, the one you struck 3 times when the calculation finally tilted, when you had reached whatever number you had entered the week with and discovered it was not enough. Each ring landed in the remaining candidates like a question they were in the middle of answering with their bodies and their will. Riley was still standing. Her feet had been wet for 44 consecutive hours. The cheekbone Mercer had fractured 15 days ago had healed enough that she could chew without the world going white at the edges, which she counted as genuine progress. She was operating far past the point where comfort was a relevant consideration, which was precisely the point of the exercise. Rock portage was called at hour 45. The evolution was constructed around the intersection of ocean physics and human fragility. 6 to 8 foot sets rolling in over volcanic rock. Boat crews navigating inflatable zodiacs through breaking surf from water to shore and back. The rocks did not distinguish between training and consequence. Teamwork kept you alive. Individual failure put the entire crew in the impact zone. Riley checked the zodiac before they launched. It was a habit she could not turn off, her grandfather's voice in the back of her mind from 100 training sessions. Check everything you did not pack yourself, twice, because the person who packed it had their own concerns that morning. She ran her hands around the inflation chambers, checking pressure and seams. She found it at the aft port chamber. A small puncture, fresh edges, no wear pattern, no salt crust, meaning it had not been in the water since the cut was made. Clean, single pass, the mark of a blade, not a rock. 4 seconds to make a decision. Reporting it meant the crew got stood down for equipment failure. In Hell Week culture, that meant scrutiny that would follow them for the remainder of training. She looked at the puncture, looked at Marsh, looked at Cole, who was watching the water with the expression of a man running quiet calculations. She pulled the emergency repair kit, applied the patch, held it, tested the pressure. Not perfect. Sufficient. She said nothing, climbed into the boat. They launched into the sets. The Pacific at Rock Portage was not the Pacific anywhere else. It had intent. The first set took them broadside and the crew drove hard and got through it. The second set was larger and came from a slightly different angle, and the boat went nearly vertical before all 7 of them brought it back down, moving with the synchronized violence of people who had spent 45 hours learning each other's weight and timing through no method gentler than shared suffering. They were 160 yards out when Riley saw Mercer's instructor, Zodiac, angling toward them from the left. He had right-of-way. Instructors always had right-of-way. He could navigate wherever the evolution required. The question was what the evolution required, and the evolution did not require him to be on a bearing that would intersect their position in approximately 12 seconds at his current speed and heading. She knew it. He knew it. The ocean had no opinion. Hard rubber hit hard rubber, and 7 people and their gear became briefly airborne. Riley had one moment of clear orientation: the boat, the water, the rocks. And she made the choice her grandfather had drilled into her since she was a teenager. Protect the head, take it on the shoulder. She hit the volcanic rock left shoulder first. The pain was electric, total, structural. Something separated inside the joint with the specific sensation of a mechanical failure. You feel an instant before you fully comprehend what it means. The wave pushed her under. 64-degree water, full gear, 45 hours without sleep. And the darkness beneath the surface whereup is a theory rather than a certainty, and the current has its own agenda entirely. She thought about her father. Not the photograph. The man, the way he had sat in the kitchen at 4 in the morning before deployments and talked to her like she was already an adult, talked about what the work was and what it cost and why a person paid that cost anyway. She thought about 37 words. She thought about Stokes saying, "I went to sleep," and he did not come back. She surfaced, gasped, found the boat with her right hand because her left arm was not accepting instructions. She got herself over the gunwale one-armed, and the shoulder told her in language without ambiguity exactly what had happened inside it. Cole grabbed her, saw the angle of the shoulder. His eyes went to hers. She shook her head. 1 millimeter. Not yet. Row, she said. They rowed. They came in third out of 8 boat crews. Riley held her left arm pinned against her body for the entire approach, and the repair patch held, and third place meant finished. And finished was everything. The corpsman on shore began shaking his head before she finished climbing out of the boat. She said what she had said about her face 15 days earlier. He looked at her with the expression of a man who was going to refuse and then found he was not going to refuse because there was something in her face that was older and more settled than the argument he had prepared. And he had seen that quality in people before, and he knew what it meant about the outcome. He taped the shoulder, gave her the sling. 48 hours, then imaging, non-negotiable. She nodded, walked back to the line. Mercer stood on the beach above the portage zone, arms crossed, watching her walk. She was aware of him the way she was aware of all of it. Without looking directly at it, storing it, building the record that was going to do in a courtroom what she could not do with her hands on a beach in front of witnesses. She was going to say everything she needed to say to Travis Mercer through Commander Elizabeth Strauss at the JAG office, through the documented evidence on Raymond Stokes' thumb drive, through the witness statements from Martian Cole, through a pattern of incidents spanning 7 years and 3 separate Bud/S classes. In writing, in a courtroom, in a uniform she had earned on this beach. Mercer pulled out his phone, typed, put it away. Somewhere in Coronado, a man read the message and typed back 2 words that Riley would not see until months later, when an NCIS forensic team recovered them from a device that had been wiped but not wiped with sufficient care. The 2 words were, "Be smarter." Hell Week ended on a Friday morning. 12 people standing in wet sand, out of 48 who had started. Senior Chief Briggs stood in front of them. He looked at each face individually, the look of a man examining and accounting he knows he has to live with. And when his eyes reached Riley, they stayed 1 second longer than the others. She held his gaze and gave him nothing. He said what was required. "Well done. Go eat. Sleep. Phase 2 begins Monday." She ate. She slept 11 hours. When she woke, she opened her laptop and began building the formal evidence package from Stokes' thumb drive. NCIS Special Agent Dana Kellner called Riley's personal cell on a Tuesday evening, 7 days after Hell Week ended. She did not identify herself as NCIS. She gave her name and said she was working on something that required an in-person conversation. Not on base, not in any official capacity at this stage. Her voice had the quality of someone who had been in federal law enforcement long enough to understand that careful phrasing was not paranoia but professional survival. The diner she named was on Silver Strand Boulevard, with a parking lot that offered visibility of arrivals from 100 yards. Riley arrived 8 minutes early. Kellner was already in a back booth, coffee untouched. 39 years old, with the lean, deliberate build of someone who stayed in condition for professional rather than aesthetic reasons, and eyes that had already categorized the room before Riley cleared the doorway. She slid a tablet across the table when Riley sat down. What was on the screen was a forensic analysis summary, the kind produced after 72 hours of methodical work on a hard drive that someone had tried and failed to adequately destroy. Riley read the first paragraph, looked up. "Lieutenant Mercer's personal laptop," Kellner said. "Our technical team finished the analysis this morning." The summary ran 9 pages. The contents were unambiguous. Classified SEAL operational schedules spanning 18 months. Deployment rosters with names, home addresses, family contact information. Mission parameters for 8 active operations. Safe house locations in 3 overseas theaters. The kind of information that in the wrong hands was not an intelligence asset, but a targeting document. The kind that got people killed not in training, but in places where dying was the point. Travis Mercer had no operational access to any of this. He had been a Bud/S support instructor for 14 months. He did not deploy. The information had come to him because someone gave it to him, or because he had reached into systems he had no authorization to enter. Every file had been forwarded, same encrypted destination, transmitted at irregular intervals spread across 11 months in a pattern designed to look like routine data traffic to anyone not specifically looking for it. "Where does it go?" Riley said. Kellner turned to the next page. "A defense contractor, Aegis Bridge Consulting, registered in McLean, Virginia as a logistics support firm for SOCOM operations. 3 employees on paper. Revenue that doesn't correspond to any legitimate contract volume." She paused. "The ownership structure runs through 4 shells in 3 jurisdictions. The outermost layer is a Cayman Islands holding company. The name in that holding company's ownership records is one your grandfather has been looking for 13 years. She turned to the next page. Riley looked at the name at the center of the ownership chain. She looked at it for 3 full seconds. Then she looked at the table surface. It was the first time in the entire course of this investigation that the weight of it arrived all at once rather than incrementally, not because the name surprised her, but because it did not. Because some part of her had understood from the moment Frank described the network's architecture where the thread would eventually lead. Knowing something was possible and having it confirmed as real were different experiences in ways that could not be fully prepared for. "Master Chief Leonard Carver," Kellner said quietly. "Senior Enlisted Advisor, Naval Special Warfare Command. Before that, Senior Enlisted Advisor for SEAL Team 6, your father's team. In 2011, he was the Senior Enlisted Chain of Command over your father's unit during the Kunar Province deployment." Riley kept both hands flat on the table, breathed once, deliberate and slow. Let the anger move through her without letting it alter anything visible. Her grandfather had spent 3 decades modeling that discipline by example, and she had been watching and learning since she was old enough to watch. He directed Briggs to countersign the inspection record, Riley said. That is what the financial documentation and communication timeline indicate. A payment of $65,000 was made to a Cayman account linked to Aegis Bridge 11 days after the crash. The timeline matches. The amount is consistent with similar network transactions documented in Reese's analysis. Kellner paused. $65,000. $65,000. 19 years of service. 2 Bronze Stars. A family in Virginia who had buried a folded flag in 37 words and built their lives around the shape of the absence. $65,000 was what Daniel Holt's life had been worth to someone on a ledger sheet in the Cayman Islands. There is one more thing, Kellner said. The email that arrived in your personal account 3 weeks ago. The 5 words. She didn't stop, neither should you. We identified the intended recipient. A 1-character error in the username sent it to you instead of Owen Briggs. Kellner's voice was level and careful. The she in that message refers to Carol Reese. Someone in the network was notifying Briggs that the problem had been handled. A pause. Briggs is the one who ordered it done. Riley stood. They did not shake hands. At the door of the diner, Kellner stopped without turning around. One more name, she said. The network has 5 nodes. You now know 3. The 4th is the Kimball name on the financial documents. I'll send you the full profile. The 5th is Imperator. Communications, political protection, institutional suppression of investigations at command level. A pause. I believe you already know who it is, but I want you to see the evidence before I say the name, so that when I do say it, you will understand that it is not a theory. Riley walked out into the evening air. The Coronado Bridge was lit to the north, its reflection on the bay below it. She stood in the parking lot for 2 minutes, then she drove back to base. That night, Briggs was waiting outside her barracks room. He leaned against the wall in the posture of a man who had arrived by coincidence, which was the posture of a man who had been there long enough to look natural. He held out a sat phone flat in his palm. Heard about your shoulder? You doing okay? Getting there, Riley said. Good. He nodded at the phone. Direct line to me. I have been tracking an unusual pattern of training injuries across several recent classes. Something that does not sit right with me. I want the candidates I am responsible for to have a way to reach me directly, day or night, if anything feels wrong. His voice carried the precise warmth of someone who had performed concerns so many times it had become indistinguishable in tone from the authentic version. She had been watching this performance for 6 weeks and she had cataloged every instance of it. She took the phone, looked at it, looked up at him. Thank you, Senior Chief. That means a lot. Something moved through his eyes. A calculation she was not meant to see, and then it was gone and he nodded and walked away. She watched him until he turned the corner. Then she went into her room, closed the door, and removed the battery from the sat phone in 12 seconds. She had practiced the motion for that specific model the night before Kellner called. She placed the shell in her right cargo pocket, where it would read on any tracking system as a functioning device being carried by a candidate who did not know what it was. She texted Kellner. He gave me a sat phone, battery is out, carrying the shell. The reply came in 9 seconds. We know, 6 days of surveillance, keep carrying it. She put her personal phone away, opened her laptop, worked for 4 hours uploading the complete evidence package to 3 separate encrypted servers, each physically located in a different state, each with a legal structure that complicated simultaneous subpoena. Evidence was only evidence if it could not be made to disappear. By midnight, she had 3 complete backups, a formatted submission package for Commander Strauss at the Naval Station San Diego JAG office, and a typed cover letter. She closed the laptop, lay down, pressed her hand against her father's photograph through the fabric of her shirt. She slept. Phase 2 of BUDS was dive training. 7 weeks of learning to breathe in environments that were not designed for breathing, to navigate in zero visibility, to build the specific and transferable trust in equipment and teammates that was the foundation of underwater combat operations. Open circuit scuba, closed circuit rebreathers with their silence and their recycled gas and their unforgiving requirement for constant monitoring. Combat swimming through currents that had no interest in your timeline. Riley had been underwater since she was 10 years old. Her father had taken her to a quarry outside Virginia Beach every summer of her childhood, running her through the same fundamentals the Navy would formalize 15 years later, on the theory that there was no bad time to be comfortable where most people were not. She had her advanced certification before she was 13. The underwater environment was not alien to her. It was simply a different set of rules, a different grammar, one she had internalized young enough that it did not require conscious translation. She moved through the pool competency evolutions with the ease of someone for whom the water was familiar ground. Top scores in pool comp, fastest navigation times, zero visible panic in the drown-proofing exercise, where they bound your hands and feet and placed you in 12 feet of water and required you to survive on breath control and body position alone. The understanding being that panic killed people in ways that skill and conditioning could not compensate for. Tyler Marsh struggled with drown-proofing, not the water, the confinement. The inability to use his limbs triggered something his physical preparation could not address, a specific shutting down behind his eyes. The expression of a man whose mind had decided the situation was untenable before his body had confirmed it. She worked with him after hours. 4 sessions in the base pool, just the two of them. She talked him through the breath pattern, the neutral buoyancy position, the mental architecture of staying fully present in the current moment rather than projecting forward into the scenarios that fear preferred to construct. Her mother had developed those same techniques during 18 months of chemotherapy treatment in Roanoke. Finding stillness inside a body that had become a battlefield required a specific and learnable skill, and Andrea Holt had learned it and passed it to her daughter in evening sessions on the living room floor, breathing on a count, finding the quiet place inside the noise. The application was different. The principle was identical. By the 4th session, Marsh could hold his bound float for 8 minutes without visible distress. He looked at her afterward. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. "Because my father would have," she said. He understood that kind of answer. It required nothing more. The 4-mile ocean swim came in the 3rd week of Phase 2. Full gear, swim buddies tethered together by a line because in open water at night, you stayed connected to your partner or the ocean made decisions on your behalf. Riley swam with Marsh on her left and Cole on her right, 6 candidates in a line, moving through water dark enough that the bioluminescence in their wake was the only light in any direction. At the 2-mile mark, Cole tensed. She felt it through the tether before he said a word. She stopped kicking, assessed the current, the swell direction, the water temperature. Then she checked her compass. It was reading nearly 20 degrees east of what the conditions indicated. She checked Marsh's. A different discrepancy confirmed the fault was in her equipment and not in the ocean. Someone had adjusted the magnetic calibration on her compass before the swim. A small, precise change, enough to walk a night navigation steadily into the shipping lanes east of the Silver Strand, where container vessels moved through the dark with draft measurements that made a swimmer functionally invisible and impact forces that made the question of survival very brief. "Abort or dead reckon," Cole said quietly. "Vote," Riley said. Cole, "Dead reckon." Marsh, half a second behind, "Dead reckon." The others followed. 6 voices, same answer. Dead reckoning meant navigating by current and swell and the felt sense of direction that accumulated in a person who had spent enough time in the ocean to internalize its patterns. Her grandfather had taught her this skill in the Virginia Beach quarry when she was 12. In sessions he called swimming, because calling it navigation would have made her resist it, and calling it training would have made her treat it as a class rather than a way of being. She led them home. 4 miles, 31 minutes over target time. All 6 together. The instructor checking them in at the beach looked at her compass against his own. Made a note, said nothing. She said nothing. The note contained everything that needed to be said between them, and they both understood it. Walking back to the equipment locker, she matched pace with Cole. "Third attempt," she said without looking at him. The boat was first. The rifle crack was second. He was quiet for several steps. "They are not going to stop." "No? What are you going to do?" She thought about the evidence package on 3 encrypted servers, the cover letter to Commander Strauss, the sat phone shell riding in her cargo pocket. "Finish it," she said. He nodded. That was the conversation. They walked the rest of the way to the equipment locker without speaking. Cole had the particular quality of men who understood that silence after the necessary thing has been said was a form of respect rather than distance. She had noticed that in him since day 5, when he had watched Mercer's kick land and had stood very still with his jaw working for exactly the 3 seconds it took him to decide what kind of man he was going to be about it. She had made a note of that 3 seconds. She had made a note of it the way she noted everything, not because she was distrustful, but because her grandfather had taught her that you could not know in advance which observations were going to matter. So the correct practice was to observe everything and let time sort out the relevant from the irrelevant. In 3 seconds of jaw working, Cole had decided something. That kind of decision, made under pressure and without witnesses who expected anything particular from you, was the most reliable kind. It held. In the locker room, after Cole had moved on, she sat on the bench and held her compass in her hands for a moment. The calibration had been adjusted at the 0-point bearing, the kind of change that was invisible to casual inspection and would only become apparent in the field, at night, under pressure, when checking your compass was automatic rather than deliberate. It was expert work. The kind of work someone did who understood both the equipment and the environment in which the equipment would be used. She put the compass in her evidence pouch. It joined the photograph of the air chamber patch she had taken before the rock portage evolution, the crack in her rifle barrel, which the rangemaster had attributed to a manufacturing defect until the metallurgical analysis came back. 3 attempts, each one more sophisticated than the last, which meant someone was escalating, which meant someone was running out of patience. People who ran out of patience made mistakes. That was the thing she held on to on the walk back to the barracks. Patience was a resource like any other. It could be spent, and when it ran low, the decisions that followed tended to be less careful. 3 attempts meant the network was concerned. Concerned people were manageable in ways that calm people were not. She went to the barracks, ate, sat on her rack and looked at her phone for a moment, no messages, and then opened the laptop and added the compass-oriented photograph to the evidence package, annotating it with time, location, and the specific nature of the discrepancy, in the same format she had used for every other piece of documentation in the file. Precise, consistent. Organized the way a record needed to be organized for it to survive contact with people who would look for reasons not to believe it. She closed the laptop. It was past midnight. The Pacific was outside the window, making its permanent argument with the shore, and the base was quiet in the way that military installations were quiet at that hour. Not silent, but ordered. The particular quiet of a large number of people who had been trained to rest efficiently. She lay down, did not sleep immediately. Let the day settle through her the way things settled when she let them. Not forcing it, not reviewing, just allowing the information to organize itself in the background while the foreground was still. She thought about her father, who had done the same thing, who had taught her the technique by example rather than by instruction, on the kitchen floor in Roanoke on nights when he was home, and they would lie on the carpet after dinner and look at the ceiling and just be quiet together, which she had not understood as a method at the time and had only come to understand as an adult when she began needing one. The encrypted email arrived at 02:17 on a Thursday morning from an address that was a randomized string with no identifiable origin. She was awake when it arrived, the specific wakefulness that came not from restlessness, but from sleeping in circumstances that required a portion of alertness to remain available. 5 words on a white screen in a dark room. She didn't stop. Neither should you. She had already known from Kellner what this message was and who it was meant for. But reading it at 02:17 with the Pacific outside, making its permanent argument with the shore, she understood something the analytical briefing had not fully conveyed. Someone had ordered Carol Reese killed, had ordered it the way you ordered an inspection sign-off, or a compass recalibrated before a night swim, or an air chamber punctured before a rock portage evolution. In the language of administration, in the register of problems that needed to be handled rather than people who needed to be answered for. She forwarded it to Kellner, deleted it, turned off the screen. She lay in the dark and thought about Carol Reese, who had been a competitive swimmer for 20 years, who had been found in a river, who had spent 2 years mapping a network that had killed 43 people and had gotten close enough to the center of it to become a problem requiring resolution, who had sent Frank Holt an encrypted data package in the last days of her life, because she understood that the information outlasted the person carrying it and that this was the form of courage the situation required. That kind of courage appeared in no official record. It appeared only in the fact that Riley Holt was lying in a barracks with enough documented evidence to dismantle a network, because a woman she had never met had decided that dying with the information was worse than dying without it. She pressed her hand against her father's photograph. She would not forget Carol Reese. That was a promise made in the dark, to no one she could name, that she intended to honor with the same seriousness she honored every commitment she had ever made. Owen Briggs called Riley to his office on a Thursday morning in the 3rd week of Phase 2, 40 minutes before the morning evolution. The office was small and precisely organized, a space that expressed its occupant through arrangement rather than decoration. Briggs sat behind his desk with his hands folded on its surface. What Riley noticed first was the absence of the sat phone. His personal phone sat to his right. That was all. He looked at her differently than he had looked at her before. Not performing. Something stripped of the outer layer, and what was underneath it was not entirely what she had expected to find. "Sit down, Holt." She sat. "I'm going to ask you something directly." His voice was the voice of a man who had decided that directness was more efficient than the alternatives. "Have you been in contact with NCIS?" She held his gaze. "No, Senior Chief." He looked at her for 4 seconds. She had learned in 6 weeks of watching this man that 4 seconds was the limit of his patience with responses that did not resolve the way he expected. He did not call her a liar. He did not produce evidence. He looked at her the way a man looks at a calculation that is not resolving correctly regardless of how many times he runs it. If a candidate were to pursue a personal matter outside the established chain of command, he said carefully, a matter relating to a family member's service history, that would constitute a significant breach of protocol. Grounds for administrative review of her training status. Understood, Senior Chief. I want you to succeed here, Holt. He looked at his folded hands, at his desk. Your father was a good man. I knew him. Before everything. He stopped, started again at a different place. I would hate to see his daughter end her career chasing something she cannot change. She stood, moved to the door, stopped with her hand on the frame. He was a great man, Senior Chief. Not just good. She walked out. Halfway down the corridor, she registered what she had seen in his face in the last 3 seconds before she turned away. Not anger, not the performed concern she had watched him deploy since day one. Something older, something that in another man, living a different sequence of choices, might have been called regret. The kind of regret that arrives too late to be useful but arrives anyway, because the human capacity for it does not check whether it can change anything before presenting itself. She did not know what to do with that observation. The evidence was what it was. The inspection record from March 20th, 2011, said what it said. The network that had killed her father and Carol Reese and 41 others existed regardless of whether the men inside it had arrived there through conviction or through compromises so incremental that each one had seemed survivable, until you looked at all of them accumulated and could no longer identify the point at which you had stopped being who you believed yourself to be. She walked back toward the water, where Phase 2 waited with the patience of an ocean that had nowhere else to be. Frank arrived in California on a Friday evening, 10 days before Riley's graduation from BUD/S. The cabin was in the San Bernardino Mountains, 60 miles east of San Diego, at the end of a dirt road that required 2 turns onto tracks that did not appear on consumer mapping applications. Dana Kellner had chosen the location. Frank had arrived 3 hours before Riley, enough time to place perimeter motion sensors and confirm that the sight lines from the 2 northeast-facing windows covered all vehicle approaches, and that the tree line to the south was close enough to require attention and far enough to provide warning. Riley drove with her mirrors, not because it was dramatic, but because Carol Reese had been found in the Potomac River, and the compass on her night swim had been adjusted, and the barrel of her qualification rifle had developed a hairline crack consistent with deliberate scoring that a metallurgical examination was going to confirm as tool mark evidence. 3 attempts. The people who had made them were not going to stop because she had not died. Frank opened the cabin door before she knocked. 71 years old, still carrying himself the way a man carries himself when 3 decades of service have made posture a professional requirement rather than a personal choice. He read her face in the doorway light the way he had always been able to read it, the way people develop for individuals they have paid close attention to across many years. You look like someone who has been carrying something heavy, he said. 13 years worth, she said. I know, come in. The kitchen table was covered. Frank had not overstated the scope of what Carol Reese had sent him. The encrypted data package contained financial records, communication intercepts, personnel transfer documents, mission logs cross-referenced against known network payment dates, and a layered analytical framework demonstrating, with the methodical precision of a woman who understood she might not survive to present it, exactly how 20 years of betrayal had been organized, financed, and institutionally protected. Frank poured coffee, sat across from her. I need to show you the structure first, he said, then the names. I know 2 of the names. You know 2. There are 5 nodes, code names from Roman military ranks. He laid out the first document, the structure: tribune, praetor, legate, centurion, imperator. 5 nodes, 5 functions. Tribune handled strategy and operations. Praetor managed finances. Legate was enforcement. Centurion was senior operational coordination. Imperator handled communications, political protection, and institutional suppression of any investigation that got close. First photograph on the table. Scott Weston, Tribune, commander retired, former operations officer for Naval Special Warfare Command. He designed the insertion routes for SEAL Team 6 missions in Kunar Province in spring 2011. Frank's voice carried the quality of a man who had rehearsed this presentation many times alone and was now finally delivering it to someone. He wrote your father's flight plan for March 22nd. He put that helicopter on that route deliberately, knowing what he was putting it into. Riley looked at the photograph. He looked like anyone. That was always the thing. They looked like anyone. Praetor is Kimball, financial management, 20 years without a single audit flag. Frank turned to the next page. Legate is Briggs. I know. Yes, Frank did not linger on it. Enforcement, personnel. The 3 attempts on your life. Carol Reese, his fingerprints are on all of it, through intermediaries, carefully insulated. But Reese's pattern analysis makes the attribution clear beyond any reasonable doubt. He reached for the last photograph and held it for a moment. Centurion, Frank said, Master Chief Leonard Carver, Senior Enlisted Advisor, Naval Special Warfare Command. He placed it on the table. Riley looked at it. A man in his late 50s, gray at the temples, the kind of face that had been shaped by decades of salt water and serious consequence. With commendations going back to Desert Storm, and a reputation in the special operations community that was spoken of the way people speak of institutions rather than individuals. 31 years of service, trusted by everyone who had ever worked alongside him. Her father had trusted him. That was the thing she had to hold. Her father, who was not a naive man, who did not extend trust carelessly, who had spent 19 years learning to read people in environments where misreading them had permanent consequences, had served with Leonard Carver as his senior enlisted chain and had not known. He was your father's SEA in 2011, Frank said. He had the in-country contacts. He coordinated the payment. He directed Briggs to countersign the inspection record. He gave the network the operational timeline. Frank's jaw was tight in the way that muscles get tight when what is behind them has been held under pressure for too long. He shook my hand at Daniel's funeral, looked me in the eye, and told me what a hero my son was. Riley said nothing for a long time. The mountain outside the windows was dark and still. Kellner's team held their positions in the tree line, thermal optics covering the approaches. Who was Imperator? Riley said. Frank turned to the last page. He did not speak immediately. The quality of the silence changed, became the silence that exists on one side of information that will be permanently significant. You have already seen this name, Frank said. Kellner showed it to you. Riley looked at the page. Rear Admiral Victor Mercer, Naval Special Warfare Command. Commander, Naval Special Warfare Group 1. The man at the apex of Naval Special Warfare's West Coast operations, whose office shaped the institutional priorities of BUD/S, who had personally signed the approval for the first integrated training class in Naval Special Warfare history. Class 412, Riley's class, her application personally reviewed and approved by Rear Admiral Mercer. Travis Mercer's father, the man who had put her exactly where Briggs and Carver could reach her, inside an institution where training accidents were explainable and administrative drops were routine, where the mechanisms for eliminating a problem wore the same uniform as the problem. He had done it because letting her continue to investigate from the outside was a risk he could not manage, because inside BUD/S she was isolated and controllable, because her death or departure, framed as a training casualty, would have been the end of it. He had underestimated her. They all had, for the same reason. Victor Mercer, Riley said. Imperator, Frank said. Riley looked at all 5 photographs on the kitchen table. 20 years, 43 Americans, her father, Carol Reese, hundreds of families who had received folded flags in official reports, and the unbearable grief of believing the loss was random, the version that was survivable, the version that turned out to be a lie constructed by men in uniform who had decided the uniform was something they could sell. Her phone moved on the table. Kellner, 4 words. Carver accessed the database. 3 seconds later, he searched his own name. Frank read it over her shoulder. His face did not change dramatically. 31 years of service had made him respond to new information without performance. His face simply became the face of a man who has received a signal and is now operating on updated parameters. Then he is coming, Frank said. Outside the cabin, one of Kellner's team shifted position. The thermal optics swept the northeast tree line. The motion sensors held their ground in the dark. Riley put her phone down, looked at Carver's photograph, put her hand flat on it. She had not come to these mountains to wait for another move. She had come to finish what her father had started, in the language she had been learning since she was 14 years old in a barn in Roanoke, the language of evidence and patience and precise, deliberate execution. The mountain was quiet, the sensors were ready. Not yet, but soon. At 0147, the first sensor triggered. Northeast approach, 200 yards, single figure, military movement, controlled, tactical, advancing the way a man advances who has spent 30 years learning the terrain of danger and still believes in this moment that he is the predator. Kellner's voice through the radio, quiet and level, single adult male, approximately 60 years, armed, suppressed rifle, moving tactical. A pause. Positive ID, it's Carver. Frank Holt looked at his granddaughter across a table covered in 20 years of evidence. His face was the face of a man who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and can finally feel it beginning to lift. Game on, he said. The sensors tracked a man moving through the mountain dark toward the center of the web, certain he was the predator. Inside the cabin, two people who shared a name and a grief and a mission waited without speaking, because everything that needed to be said had already been said. 13 years ago, in a kitchen in Roanoke, over a legal pad covered in small, precise handwriting that had refused to stop asking the question the official report was designed to bury. 70 yards, Kellner's voice. Stand by. 50 yards. 3 suppressed shots punched through the south wall, exactly where they would have been sitting. Tight grouping, professional work. Then the lights came on. 6 positions simultaneously. Tactical illuminators from the tree line with the full weight of professional certainty behind them. Federal agents, weapon down, face down, now. The rifle clattered on the rocks. Then the heavier sound of a man hitting the ground. The sound of a decision being made for someone by people with better angles, better numbers, and the law entirely on their side. Clear. Suspect in custody. Riley and Frank walked out into the cold mountain air. Carver was face down on the rocky ground, zip-tied with Kellner's team standing over him. The scene had the quality of something that had been a long time arriving and had come in exactly on schedule. Carver's head came up when he heard their footsteps. He looked at Frank first, recognition, and something beneath it more complicated than Riley had anticipated. Then he looked at her. "You're Daniel's girl," he said. His voice was level, professional. The voice of a man who had operated at the edge of the possible for 30 years and had learned to keep it level regardless of what the situation looked like. She had to acknowledge that. He kept it level even now with 6 federal agents standing over him and 13 years of evidence converging from every direction. "Yes," Riley said. "He was good," Carver said. "Better than most. Better than he knew." Frank came to stand over him. He looked at the man who had given the order, who had shaken his hand at the memorial service, who had looked him in the eye. He looked at him for a long time. Then, "Hello, Leonard." Something moved through Carver's face. Not guilt exactly, not fear exactly, but the thing that comes before both of those when a reckoning that has been waiting for a specific amount of time finally presents itself. They pulled him to his feet, walked him toward Kellner's vehicle. Before the door closed, he looked back at Riley. "You think I'm the top of this?" he said. "You think arresting me ends it?" She said nothing. "Imperador has been running this network since before you were licensed to drive," Carver said. "He does not get his hands dirty. Not once in 20 years. His eyes were steady. "You already know his name. Kellner showed you at the diner. Ask yourself why a rear admiral personally approved a Master Chief's daughter for the first integrated Bud/S class. Ask yourself what he was expecting to happen when he put you in that training environment." The door closed. Kellner looked at Riley across the roof of the vehicle. The mountain night was quiet and the stars above the tree line were very clear. "Victor Mercer," Riley said. It was not a question. "Warrant request has been in for 6 hours, Kellner said. "By the time we get Carver to San Diego, the others will be in custody." Frank came to stand beside Riley. They watched the vehicle move down the dirt track, its lights cutting through mountain dark. Victor Mercer had approved her application personally, had placed her inside the institution he controlled, within reach of the men who operated at his direction. He had expected the accumulated weight of Hell Week and a separated shoulder and a fractured cheekbone and 3 separate attempts on her life to accomplish what each individual attempt had failed to accomplish. He had expected her to break. She had not broken. The vehicle disappeared around the first bend in the track. The mountain was quiet. Frank put his hand on her shoulder. The right one, careful of the left. He said nothing. Everything that needed saying had been said, 13 years ago, over a legal pad in Roanoke, Virginia. The question had been asked. It had now been answered. She leaned into him slightly, just enough. 3 weeks to graduation. 3 weeks to the trident her father had worn and the team he had believed in until the last transmission from a helicopter going down over Kunar Province. She could see it from here. The warrants went out at 0400 hours, while Leonard Carver was still in the back of a federal vehicle on the mountain road from San Bernardino towards San Diego, before he had the chance to make a single phone call to anyone who might warn someone who might begin destroying things that needed to remain intact. Dana Kellner had spent the previous 6 hours building the simultaneous execution architecture with the methodical focus of someone who understood that the difference between dismantling a network and merely wounding it was a window that could be measured in minutes. You closed all 5 doors at once, or you closed none of them effectively. She had the warrants, the teams, and the timing. At 0400, she gave the signal. Scott Weston was at his office in a building off Rosecrans in San Diego when the FBI team arrived. He was at his desk with his jacket on and his computer open, and the lead agent noted in her report afterward that he did not look surprised. He looked relieved. 13 years of maintaining the architecture of a lie apparently carried a weight that, when removed all at once, showed in a man's face even if he did not intend it to. The man named Kimball, who had managed the network's finances through 20 years of offshore accounts and wire transfers structured to stay beneath reporting thresholds, was taken at his home in Coronado. He had been asleep. He said nothing for 16 hours after his arrest, which was the right instinct and approximately 3 hours too late to matter, because Carver was already talking by then. Owen Briggs was removed from the NCO quarters at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado at 0423 hours by 4 federal agents who had coordinated base access in the 48 hours prior. Candidates from Class 412 were awake for morning PT when the vehicle drove through the base. Some watched from the barracks windows. Tyler Marsh said later that he had seen Briggs's face through the vehicle glass and that the expression on it was not the face of a man being wronged. It was the face of a man arriving at something he had known. Somewhere underneath everything was waiting at the end of the road he had chosen. Rear Admiral Victor Mercer was taken into custody at his residence in Virginia Beach at 0612 hours Eastern, 0312 Pacific, by a joint FBI and NCIS team with a federal warrant covering conspiracy, obstruction of justice, espionage, and 23 additional charges. He came to the door in his bathrobe. He did not run. He did not speak. His lawyer was on the phone before the handcuffs were on, which told the lead agent everything she needed to know about how long Victor Mercer had understood this day was a possibility he had to prepare for. His son Travis was already confined at a military holding facility in San Diego, pending court-martial proceedings that were moving with the momentum of military justice when the chain of command decided it had a problem that required public resolution. 5 nodes, closed simultaneously. The network that had operated for 20 years, that had sold the operational intelligence of the most elite special operations force in the American military to foreign buyers for money, that had gotten 43 Americans killed in the specific and deliberate way that only betrayal from inside can get people killed, was in federal custody by sunrise. Riley Holt learned about the arrest from a text message from Kellner at 0647, reading it at a red light on the 8 while driving back to Coronado from the mountains. She set the phone down on the passenger seat, kept driving. The California morning was coming in over the Coast Range in shades of orange and rose that the Pacific Coast produced at that hour, the kind of sky that seemed to understand that certain mornings required something more than gray. She had expected to feel relief. She had been carrying the weight of what had been done to her father for 13 years, and she had expected the arrest to lift that weight, the way putting something heavy down lifts it. What she felt instead was something quieter and more complicated. Not triumph, not relief exactly. Something closer to what you felt when a very long road finally ended and you stood at the terminus and looked back at the distance you had covered and understood that the road had changed you along its length and could not be walked again in either direction. She drove the rest of the way to Coronado with the windows down and the morning air coming in off the bay and the radio off. Raymond Stokes found her at the waterline the following afternoon on the same stretch of beach where he had handed her the thumb drive 6 weeks earlier. He was standing at the water's edge with his hands in his pockets and his eyes on the horizon in the way men stand when they are thinking about something that does not have a clean resolution. She came to stand beside him. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The surf moved in and out. "I heard they got Carver," he said. "And the others?" "Yes." He nodded slowly, not with satisfaction, but with the more measured acknowledgement of a man who had been hoping for something for a longer time and was now confronted with the reality that hoping and receiving were not the same experience, and that receiving did not necessarily produce what hoping had promised it would. "I should have done this 13 years ago," he said. His voice was level in the way that voices are level when what is underneath them is being controlled through discipline rather than absence. "The day after Daniel died, I knew something was wrong. I knew it the way you know things you cannot yet prove. In his route, in the timing, in the fact that that helicopter had come back from the previous insertion with a noted irregularity in the hydraulic system that should have grounded it for a full inspection. It was not grounded. It flew again." He paused. "I told myself I needed more evidence. Then I told myself I needed to protect my family. My kids were young. Then I stopped telling myself anything at all and just kept going to work. Because every day that passed made it easier to pretend that I had not made a choice, that I had simply been waiting for the right moment." He looked at her. "There is no right moment. There was only the moment. I let it go." She turned to face him. He was looking at her with the directness of a man who had decided he was done with the other kind. "I am not asking for forgiveness," and he said, "I know what I did, and I know what it cost. I am only saying that what you did, the way you came here and built the case the right way, through evidence and proper channels without shortcuts, that mattered. It matters that it was done right." He extended his hand. She held it for a moment, then she took it. "He talked about you," Stokes said. He did not release her hand immediately. "Every deployment, every phone call I was around for. He had a particular way of talking about you, different from the way most fathers talked about their kids. He did not talk about what you were doing. He talked about what you were becoming. Like he could see something forming in you that interested him, and he wanted to watch how it was going to turn out." He released her hand. He would not be surprised by any of this, not one single part of it. He walked back toward the base. She stood at the waterline for a while after he was gone. The afternoon light was shifting toward the warmer registers, turning the California coast into something that looked slightly more real than real, and slightly less real simultaneously. She thought about what it meant to be known truly by someone who was no longer there to see how it turned out. Her father had talked about what she was becoming on deployments she had not known about, in phone calls to Stokes and others she would never meet, across the distance that separated men who did what he did from the people they most wanted to be near. He had known. He had believed in her before there was anything specific to believe in yet. And that, she understood standing at the edge of the Pacific on the afternoon when the network that had killed him was in federal custody, was what she had been carrying all along without fully understanding it. Not just the grief, not just the mission, but the weight of being seen clearly by someone who was gone, and the obligation that weight created. She put her hand against her breast pocket. The photograph was there. It always was. The court-martial of Lieutenant Travis Mercer convened at Naval Station San Diego 3 weeks after his arrest. The prosecution was led by Commander Elizabeth Strauss from the JAG office, who had the particular focus of a lawyer who had been waiting for a case like this for most of her career and intended to make every element of it count. Mercer sat at the defense table in his service dress blues, stripped of his SEAL warfare device, which had been removed by order at the time of his confinement. Without it, he looked like a version of himself that had been reduced to component parts and reassembled slightly wrong. He was 29 years old, and both the father who had opened every door he had ever walked through and the rank that had come with that father were gone, and what remained was a man in a blue uniform sitting in a room that was going to decide what the rest of his life looked like. The charges were read: aggravated assault, conspiracy to commit murder, attempted murder, 3 counts, espionage, obstruction of justice, conduct unbecoming. The list took 4 minutes. He pled not guilty. The prosecution showed the kill house video, the full sequence, the formation, the announcement of demonstration partners, and then the moment Mercer's weight shifted in the half-second before the kick connected with Riley's face at full combat speed in front of 47 witnesses during what had been announced as a controlled demonstration. They showed it at regular speed and at 40% speed, and at 40% speed, there was nothing ambiguous about what was visible in Mercer's face in the half-second before the kick landed. He had made a decision. The video showed the decision being made. They called Tyler Marsh. He testified for 40 minutes with the factual precision of a Navy corpsman who understood the clinical language of injury documentation and applied it to what he had witnessed with the credibility of a man who had nothing to gain from his presence in that courtroom and understood that clearly. They called Andre Cole, methodical, direct, without theater or embellishment. What he described was exactly what had happened, nothing more and nothing less, which was more than sufficient. Then they called Riley Holt. She walked to the stand in her dress uniform with her Bud/S completion badge on her chest. She had earned it over 5 months that included a fractured cheekbone, a separated shoulder, and 3 attempts on her life by men wearing the same uniform. She placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, which was the only thing she had come there to tell and required no additional commitment to produce. She testified for 2 hours and 9 minutes. She described every event in chronological order with the precision of someone who had been building an evidentiary record from the day of the assault, who had photographed her injuries from 6 angles and written a formal statement while the memory was still unprocessed, who understood that in the absence of institutional willingness to pursue accountability, the individual bore the responsibility of creating a record sufficient to compel it. Mercer's lawyer cross-examined her for 37 minutes, looking for inconsistency, for emotional excess, for the gap between what she said and what she could prove, for any place where personal motivation could be made to appear as contamination rather than cause. He did not find it. "Isn't it true," the lawyer said, "that you came to BUD/S with a pre-existing personal grievance against the Naval Special Warfare community arising from your father's death, and that this grievance shaped your interpretation of events throughout your training?" Riley looked at him without any change in expression. "My father's death is the reason I joined the Navy. It is not the reason Lieutenant Mercer kicked me in the face during what was announced as a controlled demonstration in front of 47 witnesses on camera. Those are separate facts. Your personal investigation of the network connected to Lieutenant Mercer's father was ongoing during your training. My documentation of Lieutenant Mercer's assault was ongoing during my training. The investigation into the larger network was conducted by NCIS. I provided evidence. I was not the investigator. You built a case against my client. I built a record. What I did is what any SEAL candidate would do. You identify the threat. You document the pattern. You submit evidence through appropriate channels. She paused one beat. That is exactly what my father was doing when he died. The same network that killed him sent your client to prevent me from doing the same thing. I did it anyway. The lawyer sat down. There are moments in a courtroom when the silence after a statement carries more information than the statement itself, and this was one of them. Guilty on all counts, dishonorable discharge, forfeiture of all pay, allowances, and benefits, 24 years in a military correctional facility, all commendations revoked. As they led Mercer out, he turned and looked back at Riley in the gallery, the look of a man trying to find something in her face that would make the moment more navigable. He did not find it. Her face was the same face it had been in the kill house when she had stood up with blood on her chin and said 2 words. She said 2 words now across the courtroom, quietly, for him alone. My turn. The federal trials took longer. Espionage charges, multiple defendants, classified evidence, a prosecutorial timeline that had to accommodate institutional reform running alongside institutional prosecution. These things take the time they take. Riley testified at the Carver trial first, then Weston. Then the consolidated Kimball and Briggs proceedings, where the financial architecture of the network and the enforcement mechanisms that protected it were laid out in evidence, so comprehensive that defense attorneys spent more time negotiating sentencing considerations than contesting facts. She testified at the Rear Admiral Mercer proceedings last 3 weeks. The government built its case on 20 years of financial records, communication intercepts, personnel decisions that aligned with network protection, and the testimony of Leonard Carver, who had calculated that cooperation was the only remaining strategy available and pursued it with the same methodical professionalism he had brought to everything else in his career. He testified for 9 days. He named names. He reconstructed timelines. He described in the flat informational register of a man who had stopped performing anything, how 20 years of selling classified American military intelligence had been organized, financed, communicated, and protected. He described the order to kill Daniel Holt, the phone call that authorized it, the payment that followed, the conversation in which Victor Mercer had directed that the maintenance inspection countersignature be arranged through Briggs, with Carver coordinating the in-country component to ensure the helicopter would be over a specific valley at a specific time on a specific morning. He described all of this at the same pace with the same absence of effect, and Riley sat in the gallery and listened to every word. She did not look away. She had learned in the months since the investigation began that looking away from difficult things was a luxury she did not have, that the only way through the information was through it. That grief and rage and the specific vertigo of hearing your father's death described as an operational decision could not be managed by refusing to look at them. You looked at them directly. You held them. You kept breathing. Frank sat beside her on most of those days. He did not speak during the testimony. He had spent 13 years building the case now being presented, had carried it through every closed door and institutional stone wall, and sitting in a courtroom while it was spoken aloud in a proceeding with legal force was something he did not have words for. She did not ask him to find any. She was his granddaughter, and she knew when words were not the right instrument. On the day Carver finished his testimony, Frank put his hand on her arm in the hallway. She covered his hand with hers. That was enough. The verdicts arrived over 4 months. Carver, life without parole, on convictions including treason, espionage, conspiracy to commit murder, and 43 counts of second-degree murder. Weston, life without parole, with the premeditated operational planning of Daniel Holt's death cited as an aggravating factor. Kimball, 31 years for espionage, money laundering, and conspiracy. Briggs, 32 years for conspiracy, murder for hire in the Carol Reese case, and 3 counts of attempted murder corresponding to the boat, the compass, and the rifle. Rear Admiral Victor Mercer, 19 years for obstruction of justice, conspiracy, and espionage. 20 years of operation, 5 convictions, 43 families who would receive revised notifications and amended records, and the specific, difficult knowledge that the official reports had been wrong, that the truth, while harder, was the truth, and that someone had finally said so in a room where it could not be taken back. It was justice. Riley understood that it was justice. She also understood, in the way that people understand things earned rather than given, that justice and resolution were not the same thing, and that the families of 43 people and one DIA analyst would live with what had been done to them regardless of what was done in return. The verdicts corrected the record and imprisoned the responsible men and were necessary and insufficient simultaneously. That was the nature of what justice could actually do, as opposed to what the people who needed it to do. She had come to understand the difference. The Bud/S Class 412 graduation ceremony was held on a Thursday morning at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado, small and professional, the way SEAL graduations were done. No media, no dignitaries beyond the chain of command, no speeches designed for anyone beyond the people in the room. 12 people stood in formation out of 48 who had started. A new senior chief ran the ceremony, brought from SEAL Team 3 after Briggs's removal. He read the graduation address without embellishment. You are BUD/S qualified. You will complete SEAL qualification training. You will earn your trident, and you will be held to everything it represents, which is more than you currently understand, and which you will spend the rest of your career working to understand more completely. You have proven you will not quit under any conditions this Navy can create. Now prove you can lead under conditions nobody creates on purpose. Frank Holt walked forward when family members were called to pin on the completion badges. 71 years old, straight-backed, in a jacket that still fit because the body inside it had refused to concede to age beyond what was strictly required. He carried a small black box in his left hand and the badge in his right. He pinned the badge without speaking. Then he opened the box. Inside was the trident, Daniel Holt's warfare device, the gold insignia that had been on his uniform the morning the helicopter went down, recovered from his personal effects and held by Frank for 13 years in a drawer in Roanoke, waiting. The back of the trident was engraved. She had not known this. Frank had never mentioned it. He had been waiting for her to find it herself, because that was the kind of man he was. The engraving read, "RH, don't stop." Daniel Holt had had it engraved the week before his final deployment. Riley was 13 years old at the time and had no idea that the trident in her father's hands would someday be in hers. She held it. The weight of it was specific. Not heavy in terms of mass, but heavy the way that things are heavy when they have traveled a long distance and arrived at their destination, carrying the weight of the distance itself. Frank leaned close. "He wanted to be here," he said quietly, "but he is watching. I promise you that." She believed him, not as comfort, as fact. After the ceremony, the presiding officer approached. "Petty Officer First Class Holt, your assignment has been confirmed. SEAL qualification training at Naval Amphibious Base Little Creek, reporting in 10 days. He paused. "After SQT, your assignment will be SEAL Team 6. Commander Reynolds requested you personally. He served with your father in 2008 and in 2009, and he has been following your case since the arrests. He asked for you by name." He held her gaze. "He said your father was the best he ever saw at knowing what the right decision was in the exact moment it was hardest to see. He said he wanted someone who came from that. SEAL Team 6, her father's team. The team she had not allowed herself to want specifically because the things you wanted too precisely were the ones that disappeared when you reached for them. Report to Little Creek in 10 days, he said. Congratulations, Petty Officer, you earned it." That evening, alone in the barracks after the others had gone to dinner, Riley sat on her rack in the dark and played a recording on her phone. She had requested a copy of the audio from the federal prosecution, the recording that had been classified for 13 years, entered into evidence at the Carver trial and played in open court, where the silence it produced in the room had been the kind of silence that no one present would forget. She had listened to it in the courtroom with her hands flat on her thighs and her breathing controlled. She had not been ready, in that room full of people, to let it reach her the way it needed to reach her. Now she was alone. She pressed play. Static first, the specific texture of military radio communication. Then the heavy rhythmic sound of a helicopter in normal flight. Somewhere in the background, distant but audible, small arms fire from a ridgeline. Then her father's voice. He was in the middle of something. The transmission had begun in the middle, the way these recordings always did. Always in the middle rather than the beginning, because no one knew in advance which moments would be the ones that mattered. "Mayday, Mayday, Bird 3 is going down, insertion route compromised. We are taking fire from the eastern ridgeline. We are going down." The sound of the engine changing pitch, something mechanical becoming wrong in a way audible through the recording compression. Then, underneath it, her father's voice again. And what she heard in it was the thing she had not been prepared for. Calm. not the forced calm of a performance. The calm of a man who had spent 19 years in dangerous places and had made his peace with the cost of the life he had chosen and was, even in this final moment, primarily concerned with what came after the moment rather than the moment itself. If anyone gets this, static. Tell Riley, a sound she could not identify. 2 seconds of silence. Then his voice again, quieter, the radio held close. She already knows. She's always known. I just never had to tell her. The sound of the rotor dying. Not an explosion, not a dramatic ending. The sound of something that had been running, stopping. The way things stop when the mechanism that sustained them is no longer able to sustain them. Then static, then nothing. Riley sat in the dark barracks for a long time. She already knows. She's always known. I just never had to tell her. Present tense. Not what she would know, what she already knew. He was not expressing a hope. He was describing a fact, as if the question of who she was had already been answered from his end, and what remained was only the time required for her to confirm it from hers. She pressed her hand against the trident on the mattress beside her. The metal was warm from being held. Arlington National Cemetery in October had the quality of a place that had given itself completely over to its purpose, that had accepted what it was asked to hold, and had become, over generations, exactly what the holding required. Daniel Holt's grave had a new marker. The old one had read what official markers read: rank, name, branch, date. The language of record rather than truth. The new marker, placed by order of the Secretary of the Navy following the conclusion of the federal proceedings, read, Master Chief Daniel Holt, United States Navy SEAL, March 22, 2011. Died in service to truth and the brotherhood. He swore to protect. Silver Star, Bronze Star with valor. Beside it, a separate marker had been placed for Carol Reese, at the request of the prosecution team and with the cooperation of the Department of Defense. Carol Ann Reese, Defense Intelligence Agency, died in service to her country. It did not specify the nature of the service. Some things the government was still working out how to say. Riley placed white roses on her father's grave, yellow roses on Carol Reese's marker. She had learned through the investigation that yellow had been Carol's color, that she had kept yellow flowers on her desk at the DIA, that a colleague had mentioned this in a statement, and it had stayed with Riley because it seemed important to know something small and true about a woman she owed a debt she could not repay in kind. She stood at attention, saluted. The form of it mattered. Form was how the military communicated respect, and she was military now, in a way she had not been even 6 months ago, and she had earned the right to stand at this grave in this uniform, with this trident on her chest, and offer the form that her father would have recognized. She relaxed the salute, put her hand against the new marker. The granite was cold and solid and permanent. Done, Dad, she said. Her voice was level because she was moved deeply enough that the emotion had gone past the register where it expressed itself as instability and into the register where it expressed itself as stillness. The stillness that was not the absence of feeling, but its complete presence. Network down. Carver and Weston, life. Briggs, 32. Kimball, 31. The Admiral, 19. The trees moved in a light wind. October in Virginia, the kind of day that carried in it the quality of something transitioning, one season's argument ending, the next one's beginning. Team 6 after SQT, she said. Your old team. Commander Reynolds served with you in 2008 and 2009. He said he remembers watching you run an operation in Kannar Province that October. Said you were the best he ever saw at making the right call in the exact moment it was hardest to see what the right call was. She pressed her hand against the stone. I am going to try to be that. She pulled the letter from her jacket pocket. Frank had given it to her at graduation. He had held it for 13 years. Daniel Holt had written it the week of his last deployment. The letter that SEALs wrote before deploying, sealed, given to family only if the thing that made it necessary happened. Riley had read it many times in the months since Frank placed it in her hands. She read it now at the grave because reading it here completed something. Riley, it began, and she remembered asking Frank once why her father always called her by her full name in writing, and Frank had said simply because he said it meant he was talking to you seriously, the way he talked to people he respected. And that respect was the first thing he wanted her to feel when she read anything he wrote to her. Riley, if you are reading this, you did something I always knew you would do. I do not know exactly what it is, but I know you did it completely, and you did it right, because that is who you are. It is not something I taught you. It was already in you before I had anything to teach. I need you to know something. I made choices in my career that I would make again. I am not sorry for the years I spent doing this work. I am not sorry for any deployment. I am sorry only that the years were not more, that I do not get to see what you become, that there are conversations we will never have. That is the cost I paid. It was worth it. The work was worth it. You were always worth everything. If there are things in my service that did not end cleanly, things left unfinished that require someone to finish them, I trust you to know what needs doing and to do it right. Not from anger, not for revenge, for the right reasons, the ones that hold up when you are alone and nobody is watching, and it would be easier to let it go. The teams need people like you, people who understand what the uniform means and will not allow it to mean less than it should. Wear it accordingly. I love you. More than I have ever found the right words for, which is entirely my failing and not a reflection of the size of the thing. Don't stop. Dad. She folded the letter, put it back in her jacket pocket against her breast, where it lived now alongside the photograph, two pieces of paper that together contained the shape of a man she was going to spend the rest of her career measuring herself against. Not because she needed to be him, because he had been, of all the people she had known, the clearest example of what it looked like to do the work the way the work deserved to be done. She stood at the grave one more minute. The October light was shifting, making the section of Arlington she could see look like a painting of itself. She did not hurry. She had learned in the months since Coronado that some moments needed to be stood in fully rather than moved through efficiently. Then she straightened. One breath, looked at his name on the new marker, walked back to the car. She was on the highway outside Arlington, windows down, when her phone buzzed on the seat beside her. She let it buzz, let the weight of the grave and the letter and the trident in her pocket have their full measure before she admitted anything else. At the next red light, she picked it up. Kellner, call me. Urgent, she called. Kellner answered on the first ring. Where are you? Leaving Arlington. Good. A pause that had the quality of a person deciding how to frame something precisely. We closed the network case file today. Everything from the Carver and Mercer proceedings officially closed and transferred to the prosecution record. I know. Before we closed it, our technical team did a final sweep of the Aegis Bridge server logs, the server that went dark the night we executed the warrants. Another pause. Before it went dark, it pinged two external addresses, not the addresses in our suspect file, not anyone we have identified. Two nodes we have never seen before. Riley said nothing. The highway spread out in front of her, long and straight, and then curving out of sight. Someone in the network knew we were coming, Kellner said. Not Carver, not Mercer. Someone with access to the network's operational status who used it to notify two parties before the server shut down. Whoever they are not in custody. They are not in our case file. They may have been operating parallel to the 5 we arrested, or they may be something the network built as a contingency, a layer we never reached. Her voice was careful. The case is officially closed. The network that killed your father is in prison. That is true, and it is not changing. A pause. But there are 2 addresses on a server log that I cannot account for, and I thought you should know. Riley drove. The road was long and straight, and then it curved. Thank you, she said. She ended the call, set the phone down. 10 days to Little Creek, SQT, and after that, SEAL Team 6, her father's team, the team Commander Reynolds had built from the people who understood what the uniform meant and what the work required and what you owed to the men and women who had come before you and paid the full price of the things they believed in. She pressed the gas. The road moved under her. Somewhere in the country, 2 addresses existed that connected to something she did not yet understand. She filed them the way she filed everything, in the place where information waited until the moment arrived for it to become relevant. The same place her grandfather had filed things for 13 years before they converged into the case that had just concluded. The same instinct her father had been following the night before the flight, when he called Raymond Stokes and said, "I found something, and I am going to report it in the morning," not yet knowing that in the morning would turn out to be a longer distance than a night's sleep. She went around the curve. The road opened up on the other side. It always did. You could not see what was past the curve until you went around it. That was the only way it ever worked. You did not stop before the curve because you could not see what was beyond it. You went. You kept going. You found out what was there. Don't stop. She kept driving. In her breast pocket, against her ribs, pressed close in the way familiar things press close when they have been carried long enough to feel like part of you. A photograph, a letter, and a gold trident that had been waiting 13 years to come home. She drove toward what was next. The road did not run out. It never did. 6 months later, she was back on Harbor Drive. The federal building had not changed. She sat in the parking lot with the engine off and looked at the lights on the 3rd floor, the same lights she had watched on the night that she had driven away because it was not time yet. The night that turned out to be the beginning of the thing that made tonight possible. She picked up the manila envelope from the passenger seat. Inside it was a formal request for the declassification and public release of the full investigation files on the Aegis Bridge network, including the complete amended record of Master Chief Daniel Holt's death. The envelope also contained a letter from Carol Reese's family, who had been told what their daughter had done and had asked, through their attorney, to be part of whatever came next. And it contained a note from Raymond Stokes, short, in his careful handwriting, saying only, "I am ready to give a formal statement. Whatever you need, whenever you file." She had come back to the building she had driven away from 6 months ago, because the case the envelope contained was the part of the work that did not end when the men went to prison. It was the part about the 43 families who still had official reports sitting in their files that said the wrong thing. The part about the institutional change that had to be documented and demanded in writing, in public, in a room where it could not be quietly reversed when nobody was watching. The part about making sure that what had been done to her father could not be done to anyone else's father by a network that had learned to operate inside the institution rather than against it. She had not come here before because she had not been ready. She was ready now. The trident was on her uniform. The evidence was in the envelope. The road had brought her here. She got out of the car, walked toward the door. The light on the 3rd floor was on. She went in. Every time I tell a story like Riley's, I think about the men and women I've known who carried something like this, quietly, for years, with nowhere to put it. What hit me hardest writing this one? That phone call, Daniel Holt, the night before the flight, 13 years of silence because one man went to sleep instead of asking one more question. Tell me, have you ever known someone who paid that kind of price? A father, a teammate, someone who trusted the system and shouldn't have? Drop it below. I read every single one. And if this story found you at the right moment, subscribe. The next one is already waiting.